Hello everyone, this is Alex and we are doing chapter 11 of Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Now, I hate to do this like house cleaning for YouTube stuff, but I looked on the channel and there's like over 170 subscribers or something, which I'm extremely happy about. And I just wanted to say briefly, this channel, you'll never see anything like a general book review like you see in a lot of them. There are phenomenal channels out there dedicated to literature and books. Leaf by Leaf is one. Chris Villa is absolutely phenomenal. We do focused and specifically textual looks at books that people are interested in. So generally books where people have already read them or they've heard a lot, or they want to understand better how to approach them. Of course, Cormac McCarthy is one of the prime authors for that. He's very unique. There will be more Blood Meridian content on this channel, but I'm going to try to take a departure after this. Chapter 11 has been heavily requested. I'm involved in a couple of Discord groups, and that's the only reason I make these videos. I didn't think that anyone would really care. So again, there will be more Blood Meridian. Whatever you guys want to hear, you just tell me. There will be chapter 23, the final chapter. I have a big thing prepared for that, and I think it'll be a very comprehensive talk. Chapter 11 features the story of the Harnessmaker. It's a very, many consider it enigmatic chapter. There are many ideas about it. I might look at my notes. I might not. I might be able to just go through the text. I hate having to look at my notes because it kind of interrupts the flow. But overall, we're going to go paragraph by paragraph and summarize the chapter in real time. I don't think it'll be too long. I'm not going to read every word because you probably already read it. This chapter is important because, like at many points, we see the judge opening his mouth and telling us something that he thinks and feels. And one of the main points of approaching chapter 11 and approaching the book is to pay more attention to what is being demonstrated than what is being said. Again, the first impression that we have of the judge is that he can flip people's brains to make them behave violently, outrageously. And again, from my first Blood Meridian video, I did falsely claim that the Reverend was killed. He wasn't killed, he was driven off. The point of them getting together at the tavern afterwards was to create a party to go find him. But it still doesn't change the fact that the people, and this is the point, is the people were convinced, they were persuaded to go after him. And that will be another theme. Something to consider about Blood Meridian is this really terrible? Is it really nightmarish? And if, as the judge says, God is speaking through the rocks and the bones of stuff, is it something that we should be reeling from in horror? And who is the actual criminal in this context? Is it the judge who is simply acting within the confines of what the natural world has already prescribed? Or is it nature itself? And are we to become friends with nature? Are we to maintain this natural piety? Or are we to distinguish ourselves from it? And again, like a proper author, McCarthy does not provide an answer to this. He is here to explore ideas. And I think it would be damaging and it would degrade his work if he were to try to provide an answer to this. And we'll get into it in the video, the separate video, but I think that's the reason for chapter 23 and why the book ends the way it does, is there's no answer. I think people generally consider it, he is kind of calling attention to the fact that nature does not have this supervision. Nature does not have anything looking over it. And again, I will do another book called The Brothers Karamazov, which Cormac McCarthy has said is a book he admired strongly. There are many correlations between the philosophy of Dostoevsky in that final novel of his and to Blood Meridian, which we will get into. Primarily the idea that, for example, God is not participating actively in our lives. God exists kind of separately. He's on the other side of the wall, no matter what. You can't touch him, you can't see him, you can't feel him. One of the main achievements of the brothers Karamazov in particular, and I believe, I'm not religious and I'm not particularly atheistic either, I just don't really think about it, but I think the only and even if it wasn't the only, it would still be the best argument for the observance and the institution of Christian theology, particularly Christian theology, would be the book The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I think it is the most salient. It solidifies, it consolidates the value of faith, regardless of what you believe. And this is something that we see in Blood Meridian, where in the very beginning, I should be able to identify it pretty quickly, after the kid rather, has gone through it, after leaving his home, he has been a pugilist, he has been shot. McCarthy tells us, and this is something we should remember throughout the book, only now is the child finally divested of all that he has been. His origins are become remote, as is his destiny, and not again in all the world's turning will there be terrains so wild and barbarous to try whether the stuff of creation may be shaped to man's will, or whether his own heart is not another kind of clay. And so what we are looking at is this antagonism between the heart and the natural world. Can we be shaped by it? Should we be shaped by it? How do you distinguish yourself in such an environment? And should we take these terrifying images, these terrifying ideas seriously? Are we not completely resilient to them? Is it humane to be resilient to violent and disturbing images? And in the same way that when the judge is whipping people up in the beginning to go after this reverend, he is playing on their value system. He is playing with their morality. He is forcing them into this interaction. And so it is by maintaining and respecting these moral values that you become manipulable, that you become controllable. Is this something that you want? And should we be manipulable? Should we be controllable? And again, is there an answer? Probably. I don't think you need to find one in the book. I think the question itself is already so valuable. And what I'm describing are the ideas that we should be thinking of as we approach chapter 11. This is after, good Lord, chapter 10 I don't remember too well. Chapter 9, oh yeah, so chapter 10 is the catabasis, where Tobin talks about when they first met the judge. He seems to be friends with the bats for some reason. The judge saves them from being chased through the desert by creating gunpowder out of a volcano. Right before that, in chapter 9, that's when they go to the Presidio and find the survivors of the wagon train, and then the quote-unquote half-breed boy whom the judge befriends, and then possibly trigger warning rapes and murders. And then they appear here. I think they're traveling through a more northern area because they, as it says, they rode on into the mountains and their way took them through high pine forests. This should be in the desert, correct? So I'm not sure. I think there should be wooded there on El Paso and the Chihuahua area, but I'd have to go on Google Maps again. By the way, many people, and you can travel through the trail that McCarthy went on when he was coming up with Blood Meridian. He traveled the entire area. I think you can just drive across the border. I don't think you need a visa. Wind in the trees, lonely bird calls, the shoeless mules slaloming through the dry grass and pine needles, and the blue coulees on the north slopes, narrow tailings of old snow. They rode up switchbacks through a lonely aspen wood where the fallen leaves lay like golden disklets in the damp black trail. Now, Glanton, despite being the leader of this enterprising group of scalpers who are being rapidly corrupted by the environment, it describes them as coming into a town looking like absolute creatures and savages. Glanton has a very almost Robert Frost moment of reflection. It says, the leaves shifted in a million spangles down the pale corridors, and Glanton took one and turned it like a tiny fan by its stem, and held it and let it fall, and its perfection was not lost on him. Right. So Glanton takes a moment. He takes, I believe, an aspen leaf. It should be a leaf, or else he'd say a pine needle. He plucks it from the branch. He admires it, turns it over, lets it fall, and it says specifically, in the act of watching it fall, the perfection is not lost on him. There's another point in the book, I can't remember where, it says, describes Glanton just sitting there and realizing his own, he's mortal, and at some point this is going to come to an end. It could come to an end at any minute. And this, we see him, this superior creature, plucking this little leaf. Wow, look at that, and letting it fall. And watching it fall is this perfect process. So when you see the title, or the evening redness in the west, this evening redness is an elusive concept that scholars are still debating. I think it is in reference somewhat to Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West. But what it is, and Spengler did not even describe the decline of the West as a bad thing. He is simply saying these institutions are melting away, and we're going to come back into something that we more essentially are. In fact, the German word decline of the West, decline, I believe I mentioned, is Wohlendung, or Untergang, I believe was the actual one, and he was going to consider the word Wohlendung, which is not even like just going under. It's not even something negative. And so what we're seeing is this dissension back into something more perfect. And again, one of the main issues in the book is, are we going to accept our true nature as being these murderous, enterprising, knowledge-hungry, consuming savages, to be honest? Where in the beginning we see Captain White saying, we're going to civilize these Mexicans, getting absolutely slaughtered. His, not only in body, but in spirit and in idea, his entire self and everything he has ever believed is slaughtered in that scene. And so we come back to something that is even more empirical, even more basic, in a Lester Ballard kind of way, who is the protagonist of the McCarthy novel Child of God. And I believe Blood Meridian has a lot of his novels up into that point in it. It is almost a sister novel to Suttree in its scope and its inspirations and its themes. The ending of Suttree, the final 100 pages, felt like an introduction to Blood Meridian, in my opinion. I'll go into that in another video. Immediately after observing this leaf, they ride a little bit more and they are attacked by a bear. A bear just jumps out at them. The bear has its chops dyed red with blood. Apparently, like the bear was probably eating something. And then it senses all these riders come by and it probably just turns around and lunges at them because it's protecting its food. And this is so, I mean, it's such a fascinating process. Glanton plucks this little leaf, this thing that was previously living, that previously had a lineage, that previously was involved in a greater organism. It divorces it from its origins, looks at it and says, wow, okay, lets it fall and observes its beauty. Glanton himself, as we will see in the Harnessmaker story, is one of the people whom the judge considers divorced or remote from their origins. He himself is out here alone. He has people around. You think the scalpers are helping each other out? No, they're all on their own. They don't care if any of them dies. The kid's act of mercy towards Dave Brown was considered absurd. Because, and they said, you know, Tobin said, if you had messed up extracting the arrow from Brown's leg, he would have killed you out of anger. And this is what it is. The people, the scalpers themselves, the Glantons, if you would, and the animals in the natural environment have the same attitude. They are scared, wounded animals who are, and the Blood Meridian, the point of it being at this highest point, means you're constantly on the edge of flipping, of being like, oh my God, we have to do something, like I'm going to kill this person. You are constantly on that edge, and in such a, as he says, barbarous terrain, your blood level is up there. You know, you've been taking ginseng and stuff, you know. And so they shoot at the bear, but the bear runs off, and it takes a Delaware with them, one of the Indians. Two of the Delawares, or the Delawares, it says, travel looking for the creature for 3 days, following a trail of blood, and eventually they can't find the animal. It just disappears. They can't trace it after a while. The bear had carried off their kinsmen like some fabled storybook beast, and the land had swallowed them up beyond all ransom or reprieve. I'm reminded of, in the very beginning, the kid in his travels sees a guy in a wagon with a mule tumbling down this bank into nothingness. And so what we see in this book repeatedly is everyone is walking a tightrope between whether you will live or whether you will die. And again, the Delaware, he fell off. And this tightrope is not just something that is physical, like you could be killed by anything at any time. It is spiritual. Can the spirit survive through this random violence? And I can see why scholars say there's no morality in Blood Meridian. It's just a bunch of random violence. That's the point. And if you remember, if you've read Moby Dick, it's the same thing. Can the spirit withstand what is being gone through, what they're going through? I'm reminded very poignantly of the men in the forge in the Pequod. Their eyes are red, staring into the fire. That is an image that is repeated over and over again in Blood Meridian. And I believe, like any proper enjoyer of Melville, that image, among many others, has resonance. In fact, in the Michael N. Cruz, I'm sorry, I think of Michael J. Fox or something, Michael N. Cruz paper I alluded to in the first video, he mentions how there are lines in Blood Meridian that seem almost pretty directly inspired by lines from Moby Dick. The idea that these individuals, the Glantons, are federated along invisible wires. They seem to be dragged along by some process that they can't describe or even notice. And again, like if you're in a state of survival, you are just moving forward. You're just walking. You have no idea where you're going, but you just know in your brain, you just have to keep moving. And so that's what we see is there's this. And again, now we know that McCarthy is obsessed with the subconscious. His books, Passenger and Stella Maris, are an exploration of that. And so I think he's also, even in 1985 here, fascinated by the idea of what is driving us? What is the origin of our nature? Is it something that is evident in the real world, or is it deeper in us? Do we want to see what it is? And it reminds me so strongly of Stalker by Tarkovsky, which was based on Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. You should read Roadside Picnic, and I can't find it at bookstores for some reason. It's not at the mainstream ones, it's not at smaller ones. Roadside Picnic by the Strugatskys probably inspired the political views of the current Russian regime. Putin, Lavrov, they grew up in a time when the Strugatskys were being taken seriously in a cultural sense, being censored even. The idea of the zone, the political zone, the power sphere of the government in which anything could come out at any time, controlling information, very pertinent. And then it was taken and transformed, but definitely expressed upon by Tarkovsky in the book, in the movie Stalker, which I believe also has currency in consideration of Blood Meridian. I don't think McCarthy saw it. I think it was still very obscure back then because it came out in '79. He had been writing Blood Meridian since the 70s, so I don't think he actually saw it, but it is so relevant to Blood Meridian. And so now it describes the Glantons here. Maybe the Delawares. Yeah, the Delawares. It says, McCarthy says, they did not speak. They were men of another time, for all that they bore Christian names, so it would be the Glantons, I believe, and they had lived all their lives in a wilderness as had their fathers before them. No, it should be the Delawares, right? Yeah. The Delawares. They learnt war by warring, the generations driven from the eastern shore across a continent. Yeah, because they're the Delawares, right? From the ashes at Gnadenhutten, which was a massacre in 1780 or 1782 or something, where whites just, a local militia massacred a group of natives on the Tuscarawas River in Ohio. So they are a diaspora of people who were repeatedly massacred, these Delawares, and now they end up in this gang. From the ashes at Gnadenhutten, onto the prairies and across the outlet to the woodlands of the west. If much in the world were mystery, the limits of that world were not. For it was without measure or bound, and there were contained within it creatures more horrible yet, and men of other colors and beings, which no man has looked upon, and yet not alien, none of it more than were their own hearts alien in them, whatever wilderness contained there, and whatever beasts. Now, what are we to take away from this passage? We know the limits of our existence, but what is contained in it is a complete mystery. Again, in a Strugatsky roadside picnic kind of way. Roadside Picnic describes an alien civilization that touches down on Earth and leaves. It's like literally they make a pit stop and leave. The zone where they left, they leave behind all these physical anomalies. The natural world is flipped on its head inside of this zone. If you walk to your left or to your right, it could kill you for reasons you cannot possibly imagine. And there's an industry in this book of people, of guides, who bring people into the zone to get these priceless artifacts of alien civilization. I'm sorry. And we've never had a buzzer on the laundry machine. When did that happen? Which are probably just like, nothing. Probably just door handles to the aliens. But to humans, it is unspeakably valuable. And the idea of a roadside picnic is one of the people in the book says, oh, we're going to go for a drive near the zone. They stop on the side of the road and take people through the fence to go into the zone. Which, ironically, this book Roadside Picnic was written, I think, in 1972. 14 years before the Chernobyl explosion, which created an identical zone featuring physical anomalies, in the same way. Is there anything valuable in Chernobyl? Probably not, but so it's kind of like past. What I meant to get to with this is there's a scholar named Christopher Muse who wrote a paper about what does the title Blood Meridian mean. He believes it's probably the 94th, 96th, or 98th parallel passing through Nacogdoches in Texas. Beyond this, at this point in history, is the Wild West, the true frontier. Because beyond this, the American government could make no promises to anyone who went past there, that anything could happen to you. He says that past this Blood Meridian, this this frontier in which civilization is being pushed westward, it's a liminal space. It has definition. It is defined by its limits, but what is contained within it, as McCarthy goes on about here, could be anything. It is purgatorial. And because it is a state of perfect savagery and uncertainty, again, it is a test. It is a trial of the heart. And again, the characters in the book are seeing whether they can withstand it or whether they will be shaped by it. And there's no way of judging how it's being done. Acts of violence, reacting to, for example, encountering this bear, you will be forced to act. You will be forced to draw your gun. So can we maintain? Can we keep it together? And I believe that this book probably had much resonance with, at this point in the history of Vietnam veterans, being literally in a situation like these scalpers were, forced into it by the government. They continue on. Very beautiful description of the landscape here. The judge is doing his typical thing where he's like taking stuff and writing about it. They find this is where the judge is making sketches about the natural world. Lastly, he set before him I skipped a page, I'm sorry. There we go. So sorry. Doing this off the cuff here, folks. They rode up to a deep gorge, as they say, with an arroyo floor. And it is a village of what we would later discover are the Anasazi people. So it's it's like an adobe village or a stone village. So the buildings are still there. You can see all their artifacts and stuff strewn about. There are bones. And what is amazing is there are bones, like just bones, it could be anyone. And then there are also there's the armor of Spanish conquistadors or Spanish invaders, Spanish or Portuguese possibly. And the judge, and this is what I was reading just now that I made a mistake about, the judge walked the ruins at dusk, the old rooms still black with wood smoke, old flints and broken pottery among the ashes and small dry corn cobs. A few rotting wooden ladders yet leaned against the dwelling walls. He roamed through the ruinous kivas, picking up small artifacts, and he sat upon a high wall and sketched in his book until the light failed. Now, what he's going to do is he is going to draw these in his sketchbook, the things that he picks up. He picks up the heel of a steel boot, of a suit of armor. What else? Yeah, and he picks up some other things like pottery, and he's drawing it in his sketchbook, and he's appreciating it. And then what he does when he's done sketching them, the heel of the boot, which is this incredible artifact, it was probably, as McCarthy says, created centuries before in another continent. He crumples it up, and he throws everything into the fire. So he sketches it, he learns about it, and then he burns it all up in front of him. It's a very curious habit. And then, very, very iconic passage here. Then he sat with his hands cupped in his lap, and he seemed much satisfied with the world, as if his counsel had been sought at its creation. This is what I mean by emphasizing over and over again the, is our heart another kind of clay, or can the world be shaped? One part of this would be creating equity with the natural world, and I think that's what the judge is trying to do. He could be like a satanic, he was really there at the beginning, he could be a godlike figure. The point is he's trying to equate himself with the natural world, just as we see in these ruins and all around this landscape. Things are being consumed by the environment. They are being swallowed up in the waves are kind of lapsing and dissolving them over time. And he seems to kind of have that same effect, as he is trying to divorce us from a conception of history. And this is, you're supposed to read this and say, oh, that's absurd. We should be able to have these things. These should be in museums. This is so phenomenal. He sketches it so that he can have that knowledge for himself, but he destroys it. And then he says, he is trying to purge it from the memory of man at some point. Webster questions him. He says, what are you doing? The judge kind of says what he's doing. Webster says, well, you've been a draftsman somewheres, and them pictures is like enough the things themselves, but no man can put all the world in a book. No more than everything drawed in a book is so. The judge says, well said, Marcus. But don't draw me, said Webster, for I don't want in your book. The judge says, my book or some other book, said the judge. What is to be deviates no jot from the book wherein it's writ. How could it? It would be a false book, and a false book is no book at all. The book in which it's writ. There are many allusions in this book to the idea that the natural world is a blank piece of paper that is being written upon. And how it is being written upon and how history is being defined rests in the hands of a select number of people. The judge would probably be one of these primary authors. I believe that the book is generally a comment on the process of writing or considering history. In the epilogue, which is very telling, it strikes of being, it talks about people who are auguring, who are putting holes in the ground and then striking the fire that God put there, apparently. They move and stop until they get to the edge and they have no idea what to do. I think it's just writing down a piece of paper. And so it is the equation of world events to how they are considered and how the world is shaped by human activity, primarily. And the history that we are reflecting on is merely the history that was authored by the people who are participants in it. The history, the true history, as we will find, is evident in all of us. And the history, like it says, in the very beginning, the kid has all of history in his look, just the way he is looking. All history present in that visage. As if to say it is a constant process. The history is right now. It is a process that is always happening. It is a processing in the same way that you are writing words across a page. It is something that history is in the hand that is doing the writing. Webster says, you're a formidable riddler, and I'll not match words with ye. The judge makes these these transparent statements, and yet people act like he's saying a riddle. I think he's saying it pretty plainly. What is to be deviates no jot from the book wherein it's writ. How could it? It would be a false book, and a false book is no book at all. The world is exactly how we perceive it, I believe, which is a double-edged sword. It is how we perceive it because the image that we're getting is faithful. But again, the world only exists in how we perceive it. So, what is to be deviates no jot from the book wherein it's writ. We can only consider things in terms of the fact that they can be considered. The natural world itself will continue on, is already determined. only say, Webster says, save my crusted mug from out your ledger there, for I'd not have it shown about, perhaps, to strangers. So Webster doesn't want him to be drawn in his book. The judge finds it interesting. The judge smiled. Whether in my book or not, every man is tabernacled in every other, and he in exchange, and so on, in an endless complexity of being, and witness to the uttermost edge of the world. This idea of people being tabernacled in others is very relevant to this book, as if there is a truth of one person that exists in the person before them. That person has a truth or a secret or some layer of information that exists in a person before them. Exactly how McCarthy just described, the Delawares faced these repeated diasporic movements across the continent. Massacres were driving them west. They were forced into this destiny, divorced from their origins, as we see many times in this book. One man is tabernacled in another. The actions of one man drives us forward. And so this meridian, this movement, is this, again, a processing, a writing across a membrane or a basin. And it describes people's relationships to one another. And we're going to see, is there a person in this book who is not tabernacled in another person? The kid, for example, he got sick of his dad. He wanted to leave and create his own destiny. And so are we in charge of our own destinies, or have the people before us written our destinies already, which we are then merely there to live out? And I think it's a historiographic comment that even our consideration of history is inherited from people, the actions of people. Looking back, as we will later hear from the judge, we do not have a faithful view of history because, as I will go into with the Harnessmaker story, we'll go into it. Now, they all get into a bit of a argument because Webster's like, well, I don't want anyone to draw me. The judge says, like, there was a guy who wanted me to draw, or who had a portrait of him made, and in Mexico, and the portrait was so lifelike, he didn't want anyone to see it, or didn't want anyone to interact with it, and didn't want anyone to, it felt like it was his own fate, and so he called on the judge to help him bury it in a cave where it's probably still there. So the guy's dead, but the image of him is still there. Now, this is not the Harnessmaker story. This is a separate story that he tells. Now, and he describes it as a vanity. Just think about that. So, the person himself, the subject of the portrait, is dead. If you wanted to look for him, if you found his bones, it wouldn't really, you can find him and it's interesting, you can sketch him, but they won't tell you anything. What you will find somewhere in the world is his portrait. You will find a representation of that person. So, this Mexican person who had this portrait made, he's gone. If you find him again, he won't learn anything. What we do have is his portrait. So it's just a derivation. It's an abstraction of his original self. Is this a faithful view of history and what it was? No. So people seem to be more interested in a conception, an artifice of history, than history itself, which I believe McCarthy would say is self-evident in some capacity and cannot be explored. It is an immediately evident truth. The judge then told another story, and it was this story. In the western country of the Alleghenies some years ago, when it was yet a wilderness, there was a man who kept a harness shop by the side of the federal road. He did so because it was his trade, and yet he did little of it, for there were few travelers in that place, so that he fell into the habit before long of dressing himself as an Indian and taking up station a few miles above his shop, and waiting there by the roadside to ask whoever should come that way if they would give him money. At this time he had done no person any injury. He's out in the middle of nowhere, surviving with his family, as we discover, and he can't make any money doing what he does. Work is not working out for him. In the beginning of this book, the kid goes to a tavern run by Spanish-speaking people. He wants a drink, and they're not giving it to him because he doesn't have money. He sweeps the floor, and then he's like, look, I swept the floor, can I please have a drink? And they just kind of go like that. He then brutally murders the bartender and all those people. The human condition cannot be contained in civilization. our moral precepts, cannot contain, describe, or apply to our actual condition as people. The decline of the West, the evening redness in the West. These no longer work. We have to supersede them in order to get what we need, to be what we can be. Anything aside from this, and we are agreeing to our own containment, our compartmentalization. And as we see at the end of the book, at this tavern where it's set, there are people who are working the scullery, just like the kid at the beginning. The people dancing on a stage. A guy stands up and shoots a bear that's on the stage. The true human condition cannot exist within civilization. It will fall apart. As we see will happen in the Harnessmaker story. One day a certain man came by, and the Harnessmaker in his beads and feathers stepped from behind his tree and asked this certain man for some coins. And again, the Harnessmaker must assume a false self just to exist in this state. I don't think he's happy about that, and we're going to see how he acts as he comes into acquaintance with this traveler. The traveler was a young man, and he refused, and having recognized the Harnessmaker for a white man, spoke to him in a way that made the Harnessmaker ashamed, so that he invited the young man to come to his dwelling a few miles distant on the road. The Harnessmaker lived in a bark house he had built, and he kept a wife and 2 children, all of whom reckoned the old man mad, and were only waiting some chance to escape him in the wild place he'd brought them to. They therefore welcomed the guest, and the woman gave him his supper. But while he ate, the old man again began to try to wheedle money from him, and he said that they were poor, as indeed they were, and the traveler listened to him, and then he took out 2 coins, which like the old man had never seen. And the old man took the coins and studied them and showed them to his son, and the stranger finished his meal and said to the old man that he might have those 2 coins. But ingratitude is more common than you might think, and the Harnessmaker wasn't satisfied, and he began to question whether he ought not perhaps to have another such coin for his wife. The traveler pushed back his plate and turned in his chair and gave the old man a lecture, and in this lecture the old man heard things he had once known but forgotten, and he had heard some new things to go with them. The judge is not even interested in describing what those things are. The traveler concluded by telling the old man that he was a loss to God and man alike, and would remain so until he took his brother into his heart, as he would take himself in, and he come upon his own person in want in some desert place in the world. He is a loss to God. The traveler has heard from this scion from civilization, you are a loss to God. He has heard, like from this traveler, you are equated to Lucifer. You have fallen from paradise. The man is considered mad. He's out of his mind. And he is going to do anything at this point. He has just heard that there's no chance for him. In a spiritual and moral sense, he is lost. Why would he continue to respect moral institutions? And he will come upon his own person in want in some desert place in the world. So if you put yourself out there at the edge of existence in a desert place in the world, you will discover who you are. And this is a man who has had to become a false person just to survive, just to be a human. And in this state, he is going to undergo process or put himself in situations where he will discover himself, and his own person will be revealed to him, exactly like the Glantons are doing here. Now, as he was concluding his speech, the traveler, there passed in the road an N-word drawing a funeral hearse for one of his own kind. There's a lot of N-words in this book. I won't say it. And it was painted pink, and the N-word was dressed in clothes of every color like a carnival clown. And the young man pointed out this N-word passing in the road, and he said that even a black N-word. Here the judge paused. He had been looking into the fire, and he raised his head and looked around him. His narration was much in the manner of a recital. He had not lost the thread of his tale. He smiled at the listeners about. The young man said that even a crazy black N-word was not less than a man among men. And then the old man's son stood up and began an oration himself, pointing out at the road and calling for a place to be made for the N-word. He used those words, that a place be made. Of course, by this time, the N-word and hearse had passed on from sight. This is phenomenal to me, that this traveler was having a speech. And then this person goes by, a black person who's dressed in a very colorful clothing, and there's a pink hearse probably carrying a dead person, and this black person is carrying this person to be buried or to have a ritual. And the kid stands up and says, they ought to do something with that guy. He needs, a place should be made for him. And it's like the judge is lying to it. It's like he's making this stuff up and just like comes up with something funny to say in the middle of it. But I think what it is while this traveler is trying to speak morality to them, anyway, these people are looking at the world and ascribing things to the world in their own sense, without need of this moral posturing. It just goes to show that people are going to react to things and going to have their own ideas about things. A place be made in the same way that the judge is, drawing and, in a way, subjugating and subordinating the natural world in his little sketchbook that he makes. And it kind of shows like people are creatures who ascribe things. They inscribe things in the same way that you would write something on a piece of paper, or you would draw a knife across someone's skull. The suffix or the root word scribe or scribo is present in here almost implicitly all throughout the book. Circumscription is an idea that is relevant to the circle that is made on the top of someone's head when they're being scalped. Someone once mentioned that a blood meridian might be the line around someone's skull after their scalp has been taken off of them. And so what do humans do? Even as it says, the Bodo cranium 300,000 years ago, which was later found to be actually 600,000 years old, was found in Ethiopia, showing that there has been an institution of scalping for now we know over 500,000 years. With this, the old man repented all over again and swore that the boy was right, and the old woman who was seated by the fire was amazed at all she had heard. And when the guest announced that the time had come for his departure, she had tears in her eyes, and the little girl came out from behind the bed and clung to his clothes. The old man offered to walk him out the road, so as to see him off on his journey, and to apprise him of which fork in the road to take and which not, for there were scarcely any way signs in that part of the world. As they walked out, he spoke of life in such a wild place, where such people as you saw but one, and never again. And by they came to the fork in the road, and here the traveler told the old man that he had come with him far enough, and he thanked him, and they took their departure, each of the other, and the stranger went on his way. But the harnessmaker seemed unable to suffer the loss of his company, and he called to him, and went with him again a little way upon the road. And by they came to a place where the road was darkened in a deep wood, and in this place the old man killed the traveler. He killed him with a rock, and he took his clothes, and he took his watch and his money, and he buried him in a shallow grave by the side of the road. Then he went home. On the way he tore his own clothes and bloodied himself with a flint, and he told his wife they had been set upon by robbers, and the young traveler murdered, and him only escaped. She began to cry, and after a while she made him take her to the place, and she took wild primrose, which grew in the plenty thereabout, and she put it on the stones, and she came there many times until she was old. The harnessmaker lived until his son was grown, and never did anyone harm again. As he lay dying, he called the son to him and told him what he had done, and the son said that he forgave him, if it was his to do so, and the old man said that it was his to do so, and then he died. But the boy was not sorry, for he was jealous of the dead man, and before he went away he visited that place, and cast away the rocks, and dug up the bones, and scattered them in the forest, and then he went away. He went away to the west, and he himself became a killer of men. There's, as they say, a lot to unpack here. The harnessmaker didn't want the traveler to go away. I don't think the harnessmaker liked the traveler. I think he was trying to take him somewhere to kill him on purpose. Why would he kill the traveler? Because he has set his own family against him in one sense. I mean, this harnessmaker is crazy and they all want to leave. And his family loves the traveler a lot more than they love the harnessmaker. So the harnessmaker kills this guy, makes it look like it was an accident, like other people attacked them. The wife is then sorrowed, and it is this sorrowing that I think is very pertinent here. She goes and puts flowers all about and says, like, oh, this poor man. She has no idea that her own husband killed this guy. And there's no way to prove that he did. I mean, he's buried. And this guy, this Harnessmaker, never hurt anyone ever again. And so he controlled this truth, this secret to what actually happened. Whereas the wife and the kids and the whole family were under a complete, they had a complete artifice. They had no idea about what actually happened. And so they inherited this false history, a fraudulent destiny for men who would be posted to a fraudulent destiny, a fraudulent history that posts men to fraudulent destinies, as McCarthy says later on. Or maybe before in this chapter, I don't remember. We'll get there. Now, how do we consider this story? That the Harnessmaker killed this guy and told his family, oh, someone came and killed us. He is taking control of history. That's what it is. As the judge will say very soon afterwards. The old woman was still living at the time, and she knew none of what had passed, and she thought that wild animals had dug the bones and scattered them. Perhaps she did not find all the bones, but such as she did, she restored to the grave, and she covered them up and piled the stones over them and carried flowers to that place as before. When she was an old woman, she told people that it was her son buried there, and perhaps by that time it was so. Here the judge looked up and smiled. There was a silence, and then all began to shout at once with every kind of disclaimer. People, the Glantons there, say, no, you got the story wrong. It was actually in Maryland. It was actually in Cincinnati. He actually made shoes, or all this stuff. They say that he got the story wrong. The judge puts his hands up and says, look, all of you have heard the story. You can change the details, but it is evident in everyone's heart. Everyone understands the story. They understand the point of it. How it is represented or how it is being described to you does not matter. The judge raised both hands for silence. Wait now, he said, for there's a rider to the tale. There was a young bride waiting for that traveler with whose bones we are acquainted, and she bore a child in her womb that was the traveler's son. Now this son, whose father's existence in this world is historical and speculative even before the son has entered it, is in a bad way. All his life he carries before him the idol of a perfection to which he can never attain. We saw the word perfection at the beginning of the chapter, where Glanton is understanding the perfection of the leaf being plucked from the tree and descending to the earth to its doom, essentially. The perfection of this this relationship, to the sense that we are tabernacled in the people who came before us. The son of the traveler has inherited a false world. He has no idea how it works. He doesn't understand what happened to his father. History is speculative. We see an equation in McCarthy's text between history, what is historical, and what is speculative. History is something that is speculated upon. The father dead, so all his life he carries before him the idol of a perfection to which he can never attain. The father dead has euchred the son out of his patrimony, remote from his origins, divorced from the thread of history. For it is the death of the father to which the son is entitled and to which he is heir, more so than his goods. He will not hear of the small, mean ways that tempered the man in life. He will not see him struggling in follies of his own devising. No, the world which he inherits bears him false witness. He is broken before a frozen God, and he will never find his way. What is true of one man, said the judge, is true of many. The people who once lived here are called the Anasazi, the old ones. They quit these parts. He goes on to say that they were respectable because they, as we will get into in a moment, the way they conducted their society. This kid has been euchred out of his patrimony, the patrimony of understanding the natural world, or at least understanding how things work, having an insight into the world. He will never understand his own dad's follies. He will believe his father was perfect in every possible way. He will maintain reverence for the world. He will maintain patience, and he will maintain a standard to which he can never exceed. If he is broken before a frozen God. The perfection of this, as McCarthy or the judge says, is that he has been perfectly determined as an individual. He has inherited a standard that is not only fraudulent, but that he becomes an automaton, if you would, in a very Gnostic way. He is being turned into this machine of something based on this terrible condition of losing his father, never getting to know him. He's broken before a frozen god, and he will never find his way. He will be lost forever. This idea of finding your way is something that renders people somewhat dumb and somewhat credulous. They will be led along by something. There are people who know their fathers, who know what is wrong with them, who see their little follies of their own devising. The idea that you can't trust people, you know, I think it's generally saying, like, there are people who say, like, oh yeah, you know, it's all fine, it's whatever. Like the black guy going by in the weird colors with the hearse, it's making a mockery of these institutions and showing, like, that's ridiculous, that's crazy. Being privy to this ridiculousness, being able to see the world in its whole light, is something valuable to the judge, being able to understand it for what it is. Yeah, he will not see his father struggling in follies of his own devising. This kid will be, again, stuck in these patterns of thinking that are fraudulent. He cannot see that, look, these ideas, these sentiments are ephemeral and probably not, you know, if you've ever seen your dad, like, trying to do something and get pissed off, it makes you much more conscious and aware of the world. Like, oh, you know, my dad's not perfect. You know, nothing's perfect. It's just one of those things you see when you're a kid, and very slowly over time, it'll form you into, like, oh, I'm a much more conscious person, and I'm a conscientious person. And I'm always, as someone who, like, you know, my brother and I, we didn't care about our parents really. But, like, my friends, I grew up in this kind of hoity-toity, kind of rich white people town. My friends are, like, afraid of their parents. They're like, oh, I'm not gonna, like, I can't do that. I don't say those words, you know. I'm not gonna, you know. I think that's kind of what McCarthy's saying, is it's like, you know, this kids liked my brother and I because we, like, didn't care about anything. But other kids, you know, they were beholden to their parents. And I think as they grew up, they realized, like, oh, well, you know, yeah, my dad's a dickhead or whatever. But, and it's, again, there are friends of mine who grew up, and to this day, they think my parents are perfect. They're great. These adults who think that their parents are anything but just a couple of people. And even if they heard me say this now, they couldn't have the realism to just say, yeah, well, I mean, you're probably right. I mean, they'd be like, no, my mom is phenomenal. She made really good pie. You know, you should love your parents anyway, but, you know, you get to see that they're human. You get to see the whole of humanity. And I think what the judge is saying, that if you don't recognize this, you will be a slave to ideas. You will be a slave to what you respect and even your morals. For example, if you see the judge raping and murdering a child, you will say, no, you can't do that, like, because of this, that, and the other, because you are tabernacled in someone. You are beholden to them. Whereas Judge Holden himself is just kind of beholden to the natural world. It is this natural piety that is grotesque to us. It is independent of human institutions, and he mocks human morality. And as we see in this Harnessmaker story, just to summarize before we go on to the Anasazi to wrap up, what is the point of it? The word here, the key word is euchering, out of patrimony. The Harnessmaker has euchred the traveler and his son out of their fate. He has controlled history. History has been conditioned, and it has been characterized by an act of homicidal deception. Again, the devil is as Jacob Burma, as I've discovered is how it's pronounced, Jacob Burma said, Satan is just 100% deception and murder. That's what the judge is. And yet, at the same time, this seems to be what the only thing that people can do. Is this Harnessmaker going to let this traveler go and let them keep being poor? Sure, why not? But the way that you take control of this situation, and the way that the only thing you can do is you can play your cards. And it's as if we should be ashamed of playing our cards. Listen, he takes this guy out on the road. He's just going to kill him. What's anyone going to say? And it's by controlling the information here that other people, like his wife, will fill in the gaps and say, well, you know, I'm sure the animals came and they scattered the bones. And she will continue to have reverence. She will continue to find beauty in human beings. And she will be tabernacled in these people. The Harnessmaker seemed to have no issue allowing her to go forward into this deception. That, I think, is something that the judge would like the scalpers to be aware of. Like, you need to be careful about this. History is completely fraudulent. It has been defined by repeated acts of gaming, euchering, and playing your cards until even as it is said, I believe in chapter 9. Let me see, I might have to get my notes up. Yeah, in chapter 9, after they leave the Presidio, the scalpers are creating fires. They make a fire, and then they keep moving as if they weren't, they just let the fire go. Because they want the people in the area to see it and go to it, and then they will hunt them, essentially. And they can't, Glanton says something like, there is no way we just cleared all the people out of 10,000 square miles. And I think that's what it is. They're creating fraudulent information. Allow me to very quickly find this. This will be the only time I'll... yes. In my book, it's page 127. This isn't too different from the standard edition of Blood Meridian. It only changes by 1 or 2 pages. So page 127, chapter 9. They are creating these fires and moving on, as McCarthy says, for this will to deceive that is in things luminous may manifest itself likewise in retrospect, and so by sleight of some fixed part of a journey already accomplished may also post men to fraudulent destinies. And so the idea that even in retrospect, looking at these previous moments, almost like in a game of poker, the previous hands that people have had of cards, it doesn't seem to form a sequence. So while it seems to make sense at this moment, in the next round it's going to be a completely new deck of cards, and the ones that came before seem like an entirely new history because it's always changing. That's what this idea of euchering is, preventing people from getting this set as you would, like in euchre, for example. What is it, like a set of 3? It is a card game, essentially. History is a card game, and we only inherit the history of the victors. But victory is not even in the explicit way, because the white civilization is not victorious past the 96th parallel here, Blood Meridian. The history is people who have secretly or furtively gamed one another, gained upon one another, controlling their history through an act of deception and, if needed, murder. And so that is why I think the judge doesn't find an artifact to be all that interesting. He can become aware of it, I think, because he's responsible or feels he is. But the fact that there are Spanish conquistadors in this village and they murdered people is not something that people should have. When you come into this information about history, like the wife going to look at the grave, you are operating under false precepts because you are inheriting a falsehood. You are inheriting the truth that was manufactured by the Harnessmaker. Calling him a Harnessmaker is important. He is creating an instrument for riding another creature. As we see in chapter 23, a dumb animal. Even a dumb animal can dance, the kid says. The judge says, you speak truer than you know. As if the kid is aware of a truth, but he has not come into the understanding that would activate it or verify it and show that he has actually lapsed into this superior position. And so the judge believes there is no history. You simply try to gain a position of superiority over other things, over the natural world. Specifically, take yourself out of human commerce. Become a master of it by separating yourself from it. The judge has effortlessly mastered languages, skills, the art of war, strategy, as a way to supersede it. And it's just, that's all there is, he would say. There's, he says books lie in chapter 9. Someone says the Bible doesn't lie. Someone said the Bible mentions the Bible. The judge says books lie. Someone says God doesn't lie. The judge says you're right, and he speaks in this. They are looking at iron and feldspar by the Presidio. So the judge, again, pays attention to what is being demonstrated, the movements of history, the dynamics of history, rather than what is being explicitly communicated about it. And looking at an artifact or looking at something that has come before, you are to look at it in a historiographic framework in which you are looking at what has happened, what is being demonstrated, or what truths are evident in, as he says, the bones of things. Why are these bones here? And what processes brought them here? I think he's already aware. Gaming, mastering, conquering. That is why he calls war God. he equates war to God, not as a way of saying, look, you guys are going to be pulling triggers till the day you die, and that's the only reason you should exist. You can go for large portions of your life without firing a gun or separating someone's scalp. It is not war in the explicit sense, but war, it is the war of the act of domination, and domination can occur in many different ways. I got interrupted though. So essentially, there is no history. There's just the repeated process of inscribing or making movements that would game people out of their destinies, controlling destinies through acts of deception and murder. And if people come into artifacts or things that came before, they might start to come up with bullshit and deceive themselves into a corner. The judge is helping us along by saying, look, this is all there is. Whether you would not like to accept it because aesthetically it's not something that you like, you know. And so the looking at violence in this book is just saying, like, look, this is what it is to be a human being. At the end, we see the slaughter of the bison. I mean, you know, this is what people do, like it or not. The morality, like the traveler was espousing this morality that the judge didn't even care to go into or probably didn't even remember. It's so ephemeral, and it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, you know. So anyway, he talks about the Anasazi, which is the village that they are currently in. They quit these parts, routed by drought or disease, or by wandering bands of marauders, quit these parts ages since, and of them there is no memory. They are rumors and ghosts in this land, and they are much revered. The tools, the art, the building, these things stand in judgment on the latter races. Yet there is nothing for them to grapple with. The old ones are gone like phantoms, and the savages wander these canyons to the sound of an ancient laughter. In their crude huts they crouch in darkness and listen to the fear seeping out of the rock. All progressions from a higher to lower order, the evening redness in the west, are marked by ruins and mystery and a residue of a nameless rage. So, here are the dead fathers. Their spirit is entombed in the stone. It lies upon the land with the same weight and the same ubiquity. Here's one of the keystones in the chapter. For whoever makes a shelter of reeds and hides has joined his spirit to the common destiny of creatures, and he will subside back into the primal mud with scarcely a cry, but who builds in stone seeks to alter the structure of the universe, and so it was with these masons, however primitive their works may seem to us. Many people equate the judge to being a Freemason. In fact, Freemasonry was really common in the 19th century. We think of it as being some cult or something. It was so common back then. Even in my city here in the Midwest, there's all kinds of Masonic lodges all over. They're still active in charities and stuff. I was never convinced of them being some malicious group. I think that's just, you know, it came out of a guild kind of thing. But I don't think the judge is really a Freemason, in my opinion. I don't see any evidence aside from maybe certain quotes. But saying that they are building in stone. Now again, why does he say that God speaks through the bones of things? God speaks through the processes that have been visited upon the natural world, cleaving bones with a blade. That is what we inherit from history. The heel of a boot that was separated in an act of war and conquering. That is what he is communicating to us. The fear seeping out of the rocks. The life of the natural world is living. The processes within them are always alive. They're always being revisited. We are simply living in these processes, the architecture of the universe that circumscribes us. And he likes the fathers of the Anasazi, the dead fathers, because they built in stone, exactly like the Harnessmaker used a rock to kill the traveler. He's literally using the stuff of the earth to exact a form of determination, architecture onto history, that this child, the child of the traveler, will be divorced from their origins. The Anasazi were wiped out by marauders, their children, the survivors, just like the Delawares, who were driven out of Gnadenhutten or those similar massacres, are now wandering the earth, have no idea what they should be doing. They are broken before a frozen god, their fathers whom they will never know. The Anasazi are now people with no name. No one calls them Anasazi anymore. But the ruins show that the people they come from, the people who were destroyed, the judge isn't even looking down on them for being destroyed. He's, oh, that's what happens, you know. But he looks at the children and says, these people have no idea what's going on anymore. They are not the Anasazi anymore. The Anasazi built in stone. Building in stone is another word for saying you are controlling history and you are manipulating, euchering people using acts that are tectonic, acts that are Copernican, that are changing history, changing the architecture of history, including the possibility of taking people out of them and creating falsehoods even. Building in stone, murder, deception. Framing, creating the circumspection in which people live. Circumscription. None spoke. The judge sat half naked and sweating, for all the night was cool. At length the ex-priest Tobin looked up. It strikes me, he said, that either son is equal in the way of disadvantage, so what is the way of raising a child? At a young age, the judge said they should be put in a pit with wild dogs. They should be set to puzzle out from their proper clues the one of the three doors that does not harbor wild lions. They should be made to run naked in the desert until... And then, you know, Tobin says, now hold on, I was serious. The judge says, and the answer is, if God meant to interfere with the degeneracy of mankind, would he not have done so by now? Wolves cull themselves, man, what other creatures could. And is the race of man not more predacious yet? The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die, but in the affairs of man there is no waning, and the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening and the evening of his day. He loves games, let him play for stakes. This you see here, these ruins wondered at by tribes of savages. Do you not think that this will be again? Aye, and again, with other people, with other sons. Now, this passage actually brings forth the argument of theodicy, which many people consider to be this current challenge to Christianity, to belief in God, and to faith. There has been a lot of literature about it. I believe the person who came up with the term was a French philosopher in the 17th century. I wish I could remember his name. But it was referred to by Christian authors even in the first millennium. Why should we believe in God if he has supposedly created such an objectionable earth? And essentially, if he has allowed these terrible things, what reason would there be to worship him or even give him the benefit of the doubt? In the modern world, we can see why does he allow such inequality? Why does he allow, as David Attenborough says, a parasite to lodge itself into a child's eye? Getting back to the brothers Karamazov, which I mentioned earlier, the character Ivan Karamazov, who is a theologian, collects newspaper stories about cruelty visited on children. He himself is a mesotheist, someone who hates God. He says he would refuse his ticket to heaven, even if he had one, because he would not like to be party to a religion that supports a God that allows such a world. But the argument of theodicy has been answered very persuasively many times throughout history. I can't cite them off the top of my head. I'm sure there are authors who have said this. But the main solution is bad things happen because there is an absence of goodwill. Goodwill is a product of agency, of free will. You have to choose to be good. And if you allow things to continue as they are, it will always come out in catastrophic and entropic ways. You have to act in ways that preserve the spirit and that preserve one another. And this means a lot in Blood Meridian. Simply allowing things to continue, which the judge is kind of saying, like, this is how it is. Allowing it to unfold in this way is permitting evil, is facilitating evil in this way. It would take someone who is resilient, who is going to resist this determination, to essentially provide faith and good works in the absence of those good works. And so again, we return to the theme of the resilience of the heart in such a terrain. Will our values, will our desires, or will our morals survive in such a landscape? As Christopher Muse says, a purgatorial or liminal landscape featuring an infinite number of possibilities, the frontier or the mythical Wild West. The other thing about theodicy is that, let me see very quickly. So let's say there's an absence of good. It just means that we have free will. And so without free will, we'd be like birds or flowers or whatever. We just kind of do what we have to do. As the judge here says, flower and die. But he says that humans are different. Let's see. The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die. But in the affairs of man, there is no waning. And the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening in the evening of his day. So what it is it's not quite like humanity is over. We're going to recede back into the reeds, as he says. It's more like the spirit is exhausted. The thinking and the morals that got us here are going to fade away. These institutions are not going to survive. It will be a decline. But we will still be preserved as something more essential. And that's why he emphasizes building in stone, so that it creates a very strange trend where as you see civilization developing, what you're actually seeing is a decline, the destruction of the human being itself. The spirit is being destroyed in exchange for something else. And the spirit, of course, would be something that maintains belief in humanity, belief in good, belief in willpower. And as we see in the example of the Harnessmaker, his trust and his goodwill was stretched to its limit. He needed help. And just like the kid confronting the tavern owners, he's trying to show them, like, look, man, I need a drink. I need help here. And so the darkening of the day, the noon of his expression, is the point when this creature that has been formed by time, that has been kind of mastered or crafted by nature, has reached its ultimate form, an apex form. And this is the creature that will go into the future. We won't be beholden to our institutions or our morals anymore. Again, we will watch other things flower and die. Why will these things flower and die? Again, because they're not building in stone. They are allowing the natural world to determine their destiny. It takes a human being who is possessed of intelligence, technique, ingenuity, to overcome this. And the way that you do it is you divorce yourself from these pointless, ephemeral ideals, and you embrace something that is demonstrably, undeniably true, as opposed to something that is hypothetically or technically true, which would be a religion or morality or something like that. Ultimately, McCarthy is someone who is obsessed with only death. He only wants to talk about death, finality, eternity. He's not taken by lesser subjects, more pedestrian subjects, which I think is a bit of a strange thing to say, but anyway. And so when it comes to theodicy, it's more like, it's not like, I don't think it's necessarily the judge is saying, well, God would have stopped me by now. God, again, is not, I don't think it's an active God. I think this is more of a deist God. It's someone who is not actively involved in our lives, or rather his involvement is not in the way that we think it is. And there are so many conflicting pieces of information in the book. Towards the end, after the gang is dissolved, after the Yuma attack, McCarthy describes Tobin, who is supposedly on the kid's side, as hissing at the kid, saying, shoot him, shoot him. He says something like, oh, what I would give to have this chance when I was your age, to the kid. Like, if I was this age and I could have just shot the judge, we would have, never had to go through any of this. The kid still does not shoot the judge. Rather, he shoots, but he misses. And you don't get the impression that he was honestly trying to shoot the judge. Now, the point I'm making with theodicy is this. When people encounter the judge, as Tobin says, everyone does at some point, and I think the judge is meant to represent an abstract kind of thing. He's like an Ahab. He's there to kind of show us ourselves. When people encounter the judge, the true evil that results of this encounter is never the judge's fault. If the judge is doing something evil, then that he's directly accountable for it. Toadvine holds a gun to his head after finding out that he has raped and murdered and scalped a child. And the judge tells him something, I forget, pull the trigger or go away, do it now. The judge is simply giving him his options. The judge, honestly, through this book, does not tell anyone something that they don't already know. And this exposition of theodicy is not something that people were unaware of. Of course, God would not stop you from doing it. And had he stopped you from doing it, there would be no free will. We would not be able to make the choice to act in a good way or act in a moral way. And so these are men, as we see, the scalpers are giving up their agency, giving up their free will, because they are being circumscribed. They are being trapped in his logic. And again, as Dostoevsky would say, rational logic is antithetical to the spirit. People cannot survive on bread alone. They need spiritual, Christian, and just moral life. Someone can starve and still contemplate beauty and happiness. And so these are, the judge is at least someone who's only speaking through logic, speaking through what is rational. The hermit in the very beginning of the book is, I think, very valuable. He shows the kid a blackened heart, as if to say, this is what the world will do to you, son. And so the kid, again, is going to try to preserve his heart, his ferocity, his sense, his own sense, himself. When Tobin is hissing at him, saying, shoot the judge, do it now, the kid doesn't want to do it, honestly, because he doesn't want to be determined. And so when we see in the beginning, when the judge tells people, oh, Reverend Green raped a kid, raped a goat, you know, it's the people who flip and say, oh my God, like, I'm going to kill that guy. The judge could pick up a gun and kill him, but he did not actually try to kill the Reverend. He convinced people to do it. So the evil is not in the fact of evil in the world itself. The world is evil anyway. Simply becoming aware of it does not change that. It's the judge essentially prompting you or prodding you into doing it by manipulating what you perceive the world to be. And so the evil, also in a very Dostoevskian way, the evil exists in your perception of evil, in your projection and your anxiety. And so this blood meridian, this highest point, is this idea where you are at the highest point of excitement and fear, hatred, violence, that your perception of the world is driving you and is pulling you into these patterns of behavior. Many allusions are made in the book to the idea that these scalpers are forced into this behavior, as if there's at one point, I believe in this chapter, they are going to sidle along this narrow cliff and they're going to lose a mule, and Glanton is like, we had better make it up this cliff, literally on a, like I've said before, on a tightrope. And if they go in either way, they're screwed. And I believe that it is the judge or this general attitude that is narrowing them into this. But again, the judge himself can be as evil as he wants. But the idea that this evil is going to propagate through other people, people will be tabernacled in one another, is a failure of the will. You need to look at the judge as an individual and say, I'm not doing what that guy says. And again, we know the judge is lying through his teeth. I don't actually think even the reader is meant to take the judge seriously for a single thing he says or does. I think he is completely just a Loki. He is just a troublemaker. And I mean, he's Satan. So, I mean, he's just there to deceive and murder. So the actual evil is not the judge itself. It's the failure of the human will to take control and simply step back and say, yeah, I'm not going to kill that reverend. I mean, I might take him to jail. I might investigate him. That's what a reasonable person would do. These people, though, because they have this pride, because they have these morals, they can be coaxed into these horrible acts. That, in my opinion, is the evil of this book. The judge himself, and again, why does no one kill the judge? Toadvine doesn't kill him when he has the chance. I think because Toadvine is employing his better sense, his morality. He pulls the gun away because he realizes whether or not I kill the judge, it's going to be the same. Nothing will be accomplished. We'll have a smaller chance of getting away from the Apaches or surviving in this godforsaken landscape. People will still be killing and raping and scalping no matter what. And ultimately, killing him won't change anything. Even it seems like Toadvine and the kid are aware death does not mean anything. It's just something that happens. And yet the judge would have people believe, maybe for his own amusement, that yes, war is the way of the world. Look at the world. Here's how it's going. Everything is cleaved through. All we have to look at are bones in these desiccated rocks. So that's how it is. And so I think the role of the landscape, as we can especially see in this chapter, in Blood Meridian, is that it creates imagination, it inspires imagination, and it forces humans, through the way they perceive it, to take on new and atrocious behaviors, so that the true antagonist in Blood Meridian is not the judge. The judge has a clear mind. He can see the world unaffected and act with perfect agency. The antagonist is the human imagination. The hermit was driven wild by what he had seen. His heart, or a heart, he retrieved a heart from someone that was corrupted and desiccated, and he idolized it. He used it almost as an icon to confirm his beliefs. And yet the actual mistake, or the error, is that he was not able to comprehend, and he was not able to resist the allure, for better or worse, of the natural world. His heart was molded, his heart was compromised by the natural world and all of its terrors. I believe the kid is resilient in this sense. He is not changed by the world. He still is going out there to look for himself in a desert place, as the traveler warns the Harnessmaker. And I believe he finds it, but he's not necessarily horrified by it. The reason I take this view is because later he will be given ether to treat a wound. I think they're taking the arrow out of his leg. And he has a nightmare about the judge, in which the judge is overlooking this cold forger, someone who is altering metal without using heat, essentially pressing coins and things like that. And that this is creating some kind of government or system. I believe this is a reference to the civilizing effort. And also to show that the judgment of the judge is artificial. And I believe McCarthy uses this very famous use of repetition when he says, "Of this is the judge, judge." So it's kind of this final characterization. The judge will then visit the kid in jail, I believe before that actually, and attempt to kill the kid. He will accuse the kid of not pouring his heart out into the common, as if the kid had any kind of obligation to do that. The kid held on to what he believed was right. This is something the judge does not tolerate, and we see the results of this in the 23rd chapter. But here, in the reference to theodicy, the actual failure of the human will and the failure of agency is that we allow the world to turn us towards this annihilated worldview, in which we reject God, in which we embrace the environment. This thing that is constantly changing, that cannot be relied upon to guide us. But we don't need to depend on these things to be guided. We should believe in yourself. Is the moral of Blood Meridian, as the judge does. And we look at him as though he's some kind of grotesque creature, but in reality he is giving us a roadmap for how do we resist the trappings of the world, how do we attain a perfect philosophy that is not beholden to anything, that is simply perfect in itself, and the results are of course something that we do not find to be beautiful or desirable in any sense. He is barred from doing nothing. He is barred from exploiting the world and proliferating hatred and fear into men's hearts. But again, the true evil is the failure of the heart and the failure of the soul to master not the physical world, but the spiritual fact of living, and the moral exigency, the moral urgency to master and not be affected by these terrible sensual experiences, seeing dead people, seeing destruction. The Blood Meridian is about forgiving the world for what it is, being able to see past it and see the beauty in it in spite of how horrible it is. And so I think the role of the graphic violence in this book is to test you. And if you are affected by it, which even the best scholars were, then it might be a barrier to actually understanding it. But I'm someone who grew up, I was born in 93. I grew up with Ogrish and Live Leak. I'm pretty desensitized to it. I'm privileged to read it in a pretty straightforward manner, and I don't find the violence to have a particular role in the narrative, which I think definitely helps the way that you interpret it. So ultimately, his appeal to theodicy it doesn't have much substance. It has substance here because he's the only guy around and he's talking, so I guess it works. But I don't believe the kid is actually being convinced by any of this. And then it says, like, wolves cull themselves, man, what other creature could. And again, the scalpers and all the people described, like in the beginning, we have the bear who is bewildered by the occurrence of these scalpers and who lashes out blindly at them. I don't believe we're supposed to look at these things as an example. Taking the natural world and taking history as an example seems to be, again, like I've demonstrated, a false flag and a dead end. What we should be doing is living in spite of it and attempting to project or actualize our views and our morals in the natural world, and accept the natural world for what it is, instead of having some kind of reaction to it, instead of being prodded by it as the judge would like you to be. And again, his idea that the world is, as he says in chapter 10, this egg that contains all good things in it. True, but whether you like to exploit it or not, is again a test of the heart. And so I think in Blood Meridian, it's not saying, yes, you should exploit the world, or yet no, you should walk away and try to live a slightly more saint-like existence. It's simply putting these two things out there, and it is showing the interplay of these two things. The kid doesn't seem particularly perturbed by anything because he has been through so much. He still maintains his humanity, though, which other people find to be ridiculous. And it's ridiculous because look at the context in which he is trying to act mercifully towards others. Everything is being destroyed and consumed by time in the natural world. What is the purpose of being moral in such a landscape? So when a Harvard professor says there is no morality in Blood Meridian, in fact, every word of it is a test to the kid's morality. Everything he experiences is meant to be a wound in his spiritual experience. Can he recover from it, and can his moral outlook survive into his later life, which becomes evident in chapter 23. And then the judge looked about him. He was sat before the fire, naked save for his breeches, and his hands rested palm down on his knees. His eyes were empty slots. None among the company harbored any notion as to what this attitude implied, yet so like an icon was he in his sitting that they grew cautious and spoke with circumspection among themselves, as if they would not waken something that had better been left sleeping. And I think this idea that you shouldn't rouse this guy, they shouldn't hear much more coming out of his mouth, because it doesn't seem to bode well for anything. They lost one of the mules, and the next part, the following evening, it says, it went skittering off down the canyon wall, with the contents of the panniers exploding soundlessly in the hot, dry air, and it fell through sunlight and through shade, turning in that lonely void, until it fell from sight into a sink of cold blue space that absolved it forever of memory in the mind of any living thing that was. It's amazing how many words he devotes to the absolute annihilation of this mule. I always found it very funny. Just the idea that this poor creature is going to fade so utterly into the backdrop of natural history. It's like it never existed. Glanton seems pretty perturbed by this, and he becomes slightly more serious about their traveling. What goes on? They just kind of have, again, this almost this savage life in this completely destroyed environment. The judge manipulates the bats a little bit. It goes to show he's a Lucifer kind of figure. But at the same time, again, what does he do? He manipulates creatures using their interests in the same way you would, you would coax a crowd into killing a reverend in the same way you would coax a horse into chasing a carrot or something. Eventually, the judge finds an idiot. Some guy sells his idiot brother to him, and he becomes the judge's last friend. He apparently no longer is around. What is it, the 28 years later in 1878, but who knows what happened to him. Then they come across another village. That's, I think, an old ruined village. And they find a dog. David Brown tells Glanton, like, that dog's going to bite you, just leave him there. And Glanton tells him to give him a piece of jerky. So Glanton wins the trust of this dog by giving it jerky, and the dog kind of becomes his friend. And I believe that this is, again, an admission of Glanton's weakness, like it happens many times in the book, that he cannot simply accept history for what it is. He cannot accept the natural world for its kind of implicit process of, look, just like the mule, it's going to fade away and it'll be gone. At one point, like I said in the book, he sits and contemplates his own existence. And I don't think he's ready to be resigned to that, leaning towards the kid in a way. And I believe he is guilted by the loss of the mule. He's guilty of the loss of the Delaware as well in the very beginning. Pick up the other scouts. Great. There were Gileños. The scouts were gone for 2 days. On the third day, they rode into camp with their horses all but ruined. That morning, they'd seen fires atop a thin blue mesa 50 miles to the south. So after this encounter at the Anasazi tribe, and then again, one of the judge's many lectures, they travel pretty fruitlessly and with a loss through the environment a little bit more, and then they finally find a fire 50 miles south. So we end this chapter with, they try to have this moment when they are a bit introspective and things are morally on the uptick, and then they're like, oh, there's some more people to kill. Let's just get back to it, And so they're going to continue in their job no matter what. Now, to summarize everything we've talked about, which I hate to do because there's so much, with the Harnessmaker story, what the judge is describing is the process of the fabrication of history, in which it is being created through in the same way that you'd be playing poker, the hand is always changing to the extent that you won't be able to make sense of the hands in sequence looking back on them. And so the changes moment to moment in history are just non sequiturs. It's an act of deception. The traveler occurred with the Harnessmaker. The Harnessmaker killed him and then spread a lie about his death. The kid will never know what happened to his father, the son of the traveler. The son of the traveler will never understand that he was killed through an act of deception. He will continue to take the world seriously for what it is. He will not see what it truly is, which is just a landscape of deception and gaming. But the gaming isn't like getting the advantage over other people. And yet the son of the Harnessmaker becomes aware that, well, my God, all you do is kill and deceive in this life, and that's it. And so I'm going to go do that. He becomes a killer of men. And so it's really just which lineage do you inherit? Are you a victim, or are you the euchrer? Are you euchering people out of their patrimony, or have you been euchred? The judge would like to position himself in the superior position. Tobin challenges him there and says, yeah, well, they both seem kind of equally screwed. The killer of men is not really... why would you just be a killer? The judge says, well, because killing is a way of life. And that's, again, he has kind of demonstrated that, yes, that's how you take control of history. Whether you'd like to or not, obviously, I think is up to you. But overall, I don't think we're supposed to look at what the judge says and think, he's right, which is what many readers do. You're supposed to be looking at what he is saying in the context of this environment, primarily the landscape, in which he seems to be trying to find equity with the natural world. Again, he looks as though his counsel was sought at its creation. He's trying to act like everything is perfect in this world because I believe it to be. But once again, if you go through everything he says, he never quite says anything that could be qualified or had any qualification. Anyone could have said it. He has some insight. He has some knowledge, like languages, technique. He can turn a bunch of materials into gunpowder. But once again, it's just kind of moving things around. It's just simply harnessing what is under our feet. And I think that generally, what we are doing to take away from this is McCarthy might be telling us, look, do you honestly want to live as a harness maker? Do you honestly want to be exploited and live desperately in this way? Or are you going to do something about it? And the sort of the harness maker is not tolerable. People need something more than that. And so why is war God? Why do people euchre one another out of their patrimony? Because the other option is simply intolerable. You're going to be a slave to your circumstances. In the very beginning, the kid walks through Memphis and sees blacks, as it's said, still picking cotton. Well, this is 1849 or 1847 or 8 that he leaves, so slavery is still an institution. And he sees that these people have been pushed aside. These people are living among the reeds. They have been conquered by history in the same way the sons of the dead Anasazi father have been, they've been sent out, cast out into the outer dark, if you would, it's right there, like the other book by McCarthy. And so they don't know, they're trying to find their way. They will find their way by appealing to the most basic and primordial instincts of the human being, which is deception, death, the weaponization of the individual. That is what the judge wants, to turn the individual into a weapon. The kid resists this throughout the book. He commits acts of mindless violence, as it says in the very beginning. Not violence that is rooted in anything. Violence in terms of he is a creature, he's simply responding, and in a Dostoevskian way, in the way that Dmitry Karamazov, despite committing and acting in this objectionable way, I believe ultimately is absolved. He ultimately is innocent because he admits that, as it says in the Brothers Karamazov, beauty is a thing that is both alluring and terrible. Within it, God and the devil are at war, and the battlefield is the heart of man. And I believe that applies directly to Blood Meridian. We need to acknowledge that the battle is strictly internal, and it is a battle between what you might call good and evil. And that to admit one side or the other would be a mistake. But to admit this perfect goodness, like in the sense of Tobin, who is an ex-priest, who admits at least that there is still good in the world, is equally a mistake as being perfectly evil, like the satanic judge. And Glanton just seems to be surviving as an element of this gang, trying to find his own means and his own ends by instrumentalizing the judge, who, again, turns people into kind of subjects of his will, or at least converts them into something that is an analog of himself. So generally, that's my interpretation of chapter 11. It might not be satisfactory in terms of what people were looking for, but I believe that it's pretty thorough according to, again, the text itself. And I think McCarthy, who has been said to have just put everything on the page, as he himself said, I don't think there's much missing from the text in terms of insight. You do have the paper by Michael, am I getting it right? Michael Cruz, who he finds references to texts in particular, but we know that Blood Meridian is inspired by Oswald Spengler, Herman Melville, and things like that. So we have the connections, and I believe that the Melvillian side of it is very evident here. And again, I think the point of chapter 11 really does summarize a lot of the book, and it explicates. And I believe through the book itself, McCarthy has told us the story. He's shown us some things that are happening. And then I think in 11, he is trying to stop and say, okay, we're going to take a minute. The judge is going to tell us a story. We're going to stop and really think about the book. And so I think the story of the Harnessmaker, despite being a digression, is an invitation to think back on what we have seen and anticipate the second half of the book. And I do think that 11 is kind of the centerfold. Even 23 is kind of exists on its own. It exists as it's a first epilogue, if you would. The final epilogue in the end, which is very cryptic, I think, again, is just an impression and just an abstract approach to what has already been said, which is logically what the epilogue would be. McCarthy needs to provide some kind of qualified final perspective on what he is suggesting in order to attain a sense of validity in expressing it. So that's chapter 11. I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. We will do chapter 23 at another time. At the same time, I would like to do the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky sometime, but it might be many videos because there's too much to go over with the book. I don't think you can put that book into one video, and I've seen one-off videos that I have not been satisfied with. I don't think there's any satisfactory interpretation of Karamazov outside of these recorded lectures by actual theological professors and things like that. I'll post some that I find interesting. I did a review of the January 6th report. We looked at the nature of the tone. I'll put The Idiot by Dostoevsky back on the channel. I didn't like the original recording because the audio was just insufferable. I am working on notes for Native Son by Richard Wright, which we will do very, very soon. In the meantime, anything else you'd like me to review, I'll absolutely do it. I will be doing Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. I'll probably do the Great Westerns at some point, in which Blood Meridian will be one of them, but there's a whole series of them that are these kind of postmodern, or are these kind of deconstructionist, progressive Westerns, if you would. The famous ones, if you would. You have Louis L'Amour and Owen Wister, where it's just kind of dudes spitting and smoking, but then there are the slightly more literary and institutional ones that we will look at. Overall, thanks so much for tuning in. Anything else I can do, please leave something in the comments, and I will absolutely do my best to oblige. Thanks so much for watching, and please try to preserve your sanity with this book. Thanks so much.